right. Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. It is terrific to actually see all these warm bodies in person, and not only all those floating heads on Zoom. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center here, and founded by Shelby White and the Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. While the pandemic is not exactly done with changing our world, I am pleased to note that the Graduate Center at CUNY is now open, and this autumn semester we are hosting a half dozen in-person events. Some of our events will also be only on Zoom, but even our in-person events like this one will also be available on Zoom. Please note that our next event will be on this Thursday, October 13th at 4 p.m. in collaboration with the Women Writing Live Center, and it will feature Ava Chin, talking about her book, Mott Street, a Chinese-American family story of exclusion and homecoming. Also, that very same evening, we are hosting an in-person event here in the Elebash Hall with the great journalist and biographer David Moranis to discuss his new biography of Jim Thorpe. He will be in conversation with David Zirin, the Nation magazine sports columnist. I bet you didn't know that the Nation had a sports columnist. And then on October 18th at 6:30 p.m., the general public is invited to view online our annual Leon Levy biography lecture featuring Ramachandra Guha. His speech is entitled Getting to Know Gandhi, an Indian Biographer's Journey. Guha is perhaps India's most courageous public intellectual at the moment, so I urge everyone to tune in to this lecture. Mark your calendars and register for these events on the Leon Levy website, and please encourage your friends and relatives to subscribe to our digital mailing list on our website. But tonight I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Meier, a former Leon Levy Fellow, to talk about his magisterial biography, Morganthau, Power, Privilege, and the Rise of an American Dynasty. Meier is the author of Black Earth, a journey through Russia after the fall, and The Lost Spy, an American in Stalin's Secret Service. He has reported on Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus for 2 decades, including as Moscow correspondent for Time. And he is a contributor to the New York Times Magazine. Meier has received numerous fellowships from the National Endowment for Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where he and I first met 20 years ago, the Alicia Patterson Foundation, and the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library. He presently teaches at the New School. Andrew will be signing books in the lobby at the conclusion of this event, and I hope each and every one of you will buy at least one copy. Our online audience can go to books.org for links to an independent bookstore. Andrew and I will now be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we will take questions from our audience, our real audience, and our virtual audience as well. But before I begin the conversation, I want to say a few words about Meier's own biographical journey. Biography is a demanding art that requires a certain degree of obsession. Quote, "Writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle," said George Orwell, "like a long bout of some painful illness. One would never undertake such a thing if one were not driven on by some demon whom one can neither resist nor understand." I know that Andrew experienced this because he spent 8 long years on this project. He was a Leon Levy Biography Fellow way back in 2013. He interviewed nearly 500 individuals. He spent hundreds of hours alone with the DA, Robert M. Morganthau. He visited literally dozens of public archives, private archives, and presidential libraries. And then he wrote a multi-generational biography of the Morganthaus that covers 153 years. Yes, it is a very long book. but I'd like to compare it, if I may, to Robert Caro's Power Broker. It is an absolutely stunning achievement, a biography that I'm sure will be used for decades to come to understand the history of this country and New York City. I guess you can see that I liked the book. So let me now get Andrew to explain a bit how he survived this biographical journey. So Andrew, let's begin with why the Morganthaus. What drew you to this subject? We're talking about Lazarus, Henry Morganthau, Treasury Secretary Henry M. Jr., and Bob Morganthau. And I just want to draw on a quote you have in your book where you quote Ed Koch saying, "They were the closest we've got to royalty in New York City." Give us a thumbnail sketch of the four main characters.
I'll get to the thumbnails in just a second. I want to thank you for that incredible introduction. You literally took my breath away. So, and you also make me sound like I went through a couple of bouts of insanity, which is not entirely untrue. We'll get into that. And I also want to thank the Graduate Center and Shelby White and the Leon Levy Center for Biography. It really is, as I was just saying before we started, I think it's the most democratic institution in New York. And it was a great place, actually, to write this book. It was more than a decade in the making, but I really broke the spine of this book here on I forgot what floor it was. It was so long ago. The 8th floor?
6th floor.
6th floor at the Levy Center. And it's an extraordinary place to have really written this book, particularly with so many ghosts. Many of you know this is the old B. Altman store. Someone came and visited, and she said, "I bought my wedding dress here." And I said, "You won't recognize it by the corridors." So thank you. It began as a small undertaking, like all big undertakings tend to do. And many the historians who had come before me and had known the Morganthaus firsthand, whatever generation generally, the Secretary of the Treasury, both encouraged me and warned me. Both encouraged me and warned me, which of course only led me to the river, so to speak. And I had finished my second book, which was on a young man who was killed by Joseph Stalin, an American Comintern agent who became a Soviet agent, and named Isaiah Cy Oggins, who graduated Columbia College in 1920 at the height of the Red Scare. And I had spent probably 4 years chasing ghosts. And I was sick of chasing ghosts. And I knew I wanted to do another biography. And I wanted to do someone who was still alive. And I looked around New York City.
A subject where there are lots of sources.
Yes, and I wanted it to be a New York story. I didn't think it would be 153 years, but I was casting around and I looked at the then mayor, Mike Bloomberg. And I was writing at the time, beginning to write for the New York Times Magazine. I had been in Moscow for time and had been going back and forth almost every year to write from Russia for the Times Magazine. I didn't want to do another Russia book. Didn't want to do Putin. And I met the DA. And when I met him, I had been at the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library. And there, among a few other million books, they have a copy of Lazarus Morganthau's Lebensgeschichte, written in 1842 when he was, I think, 24 years old, about to get married. And he is the patriarch. He's the first Morganthau to come to New York. And when I read that, I thought, wow, this could be more than a biography of one man who I knew something about, who in New York had never heard the name Morganthau. So one of the great problems with this book, what are you working on? Morganthau? Everyone has a Morganthau story. Almost everyone I met always had, and you wanted to listen to it. Inevitably, there was a payoff. And when I read that book, I thought, oh, this could be a multi-generational epic. And when I met the DA, it was under the guise of doing a magazine profile. He was 89 years old. He was running again. It would have been his 10th election, and he had a slogan, 90 and 09. And so he received me in what has been called the largest office in New York City. And he kind of motioned to the end of the long conference table. And you could tell, even then, which was his chair. There were 12 chairs around the conference table. And there was one chair in worn leather. The chair was worn, and the trestle underneath the table was worn, where for 35 years he had put his feet. And we just talked. It, of course, was an interview.
So he charmed you.
He tested me. There was a vetting.
There was a vetting.
There was a vetting. And I remember distinctly, it was 45 minutes, and after an hour and a half, I started, as you do, you're wondering, doesn't this guy have anything better to do? And I saw the line of assistant district attorneys forming at the door. And they were standing there waiting. And then every once in a while, Ida Van Lint, who was his long-serving and long-suffering assistant from day one, would poke her head in and said, you've got lunch, or you've got these appointments, or you've got New York One TV, someone coming. And he just, which I soon learned was his way, blithely ignored everything else. And then after an hour and a half said, are you hungry?
Oh, wow.
And then that was because I had spoken about his great-grandfather Lazarus, and that was where I think he realized this is not an interview for a magazine article, but a possible book.
That's when you knew it was a biography.
I think that's when he knew.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it was about 8 months or so figuring out the scope of this and whether it was even feasible. And then I discovered the paper trail at Hyde Park.
Well, that leads me to my next question. I want to talk a little bit about the challenges you face as a biographer. And in this book, I think the major challenge is probably just the mountain of sources. Specifically, Secretary of Treasury Robert Morganthau's diaries, which come to 872 volumes with 60 million words.
Yeah, that's Henry Jr. One of the things our kids, we have 2 daughters, and they would always say, Dad, the problem with this book is there's too many Henrys, which is true. And so the Secretary of Treasury, Henry Jr., had what they're called the Morganthau Diaries, and now they're digitized. When I started, they were not digitized. You would have to make the pilgrimage up to Hyde Park to the Roosevelt Library, which is a great and wonderful pilgrimage to make. And as you say, there are almost 900 volumes, physical volumes. Early on, and I can't remember who it was probably just blind luck, if not intuition. I made a different pilgrimage, and I went to go see the great historian John Morton Blum at Yale. And Professor Blum did many incredible things in his life. One, I think he taught more presidents than any other university professor in American history. He also spent a dozen years, at least, with Henry Jr., the Secretary of Treasury, after the war, when he was trying to find a historian to help him sort through that mountain you're just talking about.
And he eventually published an abridged 3 volumes?
It was abridged 3 volumes, and then they abridged it even further to a single volume. And it was something of a bestseller for reasons that we might get into. And because it wasn't just a diary, what it was, and it is, an extraordinary historical document. Everything that crossed his desk, everything that went in and almost everything that went out is there. And including transcripts. So not only are the Morganthau diaries, without getting into the weeds, there's the presidential diaries that he recorded with an Edison dictaphone after every meeting, every lunch, which he had every Monday with FDR. Yeah. He would go back to his office, sound familiar, and say, these are the highlights, this is what we said, this is what the president said. And then there are even transcripts where he had a little button in his office where he would record.
Incredible.
Anyone coming in, yeah. Including Joe Kennedy, yeah.
So he was a very odd duck. One of your sources called him Eeyore, because in his relationship with FDR, he was always the pessimist, always black, always a little bit depressed, very cautious. He never finished high school, right?
He never finished high school. He never finished college. And yet he was one of the longest serving cabinet members in U.S. history. And it was Professor Blum who taught me that early on because he had spent so much years with him. He said something which I'm not sure is true, but he said, I don't think he ever read a book cover to cover. And I think he had terrible eyesight. He was horrible nearsightedness. But that wasn't it. I think he actually had dyslexia. And Henry III, the DA's older brother, who passed away at 101 recently, said, oh, there's no question, my father had undiagnosed dyslexia. And I'm not an expert in dyslexia, but what I was told was he couldn't do the minutiae, although he tried, but he did have this extraordinary capacity for looking far, for vision, in a way that FDR really didn't. FDR was making things up as he went, and sometimes in horrific fashion. Reporting and looking in the archives while we had Mr. Trump in office, sometimes I saw incredible parallels, some of which other people have noted as well in their books. FDR was making up incredible policy on the fly. But Henry Morganthau ended up being this master bureaucrat, in part, I think, because of that dyslexia. He delegated brilliantly. He grew the Treasury Department, had about 18 different arms. And he delegated, and he could see where things needed to go. And of course, he was, FDR's, as you were saying, he was his whipping boy, but he also was the guy who, when FDR needed to do something absolutely dangerous and also outlandish, he had Henry do it. He called him Henry the Morgue. Henry the Morgue, because he did have this incredible dark, sour face.
They were
glowering.
neighbors, fellow farmers, and we've passed over his father, but let's talk a little bit about his father who did so much to build this city.
Right. I think part of what you're saying about Henry Jr.'s, I guess, chippiness, it's a good English word. He was incredibly chippy. He was very suspicious as well. He was intelligent, but he had a serious father complex. Henry Sr., Lazarus's middle son, Lazarus, who was the patriarch who came to Brooklyn in 1866, had been a cigar baron, a very successful cigar baron, who had grown up with nothing, orphaned early in the south of Germany. Lazarus comes to New York penniless because of the Lincoln Tariff Acts of the Civil War, and he lost all of his money, almost all of his money. He was lucky enough that he could sell his mansion in Mannheim, which was one of the biggest mansions then. He did come with some money. They lived in Brooklyn, about 2 blocks from where we now live, in 1866. Moved to Manhattan. Henry Sr. becomes the all-American boy. He's the middle of 9 sons, and decides that he's going to do everything that his father did not do. His father was a gambler, not literally a gambler, but a risk taker, an inventor, this incredible shapeshifter. When I first met the DA, I knew very little about Lazarus other than what he wrote in his own life story, his own diary, when he was in his 20s. What I learned, though, over the years, looking at really in the archives of the Library of Congress, is that he was probably the most fascinating character and one of the most fascinating characters of 19th century New York. There is a movie to be made about Lazarus Morganthau. And even, I recently was reading a memoir of someone from the 1920s, and he describes this man sitting in the park who spoke with very little English, with a heavy accented German, but wore this impeccable outfit, always with a Prince Alfred, and a white cravat, which he used to make by hand. And that's Lazarus Morganthau. But he ended up an utter failure, living alone, and that's it, as I hope is clear in the book.
A little bit off, a little bit crazy, very eccentric, and his son, the one we're talking about, has real father issues with him, right?
I mean, and with good reason. He was eccentric, but if you read the family letters close enough, you'll see that they actually had him committed. to an insane asylum, an institution in White Plains, and Henry Sr., his son, had to hire the Pinkerton agency to keep him away during his wedding because they were worried. And there was abuse, and there was with his mother.
Family politics is always complicated.
Yeah, and this spilled out into the pages of the New York Times and into the pages of the German press, which was this boiling German press at the time. But the long story short, in terms of Henry Sr., is he goes to Columbia Law. At that time, you could go without a college degree. He was forced to quit City College because of Lazarus' errant ways. He goes to law school. He starts his own firm, rather miraculously, with two friends, three young Jewish men in their mid-20s.
And he begins to buy real estate.
And he starts buying real estate. And he takes on the Astors. He takes on everyone he possibly can.
Yeah, he's a brilliant developer and creates the family fortune. So.
Right. And married very well.
His son is this high school dropout, college dropout, who then decides he wants to become a gentleman farmer, happens to buy this property next door to FDR, and they become good friends.
Yeah, and throughout all of that, Guy, all of that is the specter of the father hovering very close. Yeah. And in fact, I found a letter where the son, Junior, says, the reason why I want to go to farming is because it's the one thing you know nothing about.
Right. So there's an interesting generational theme here between the Henry Morganthau, who becomes appointed ambassador to Turkey, the father of the gentleman farmer, who then becomes, he's only there for 2 years, but famously he reports on the Armenian genocide in graphic detail. And these reports become very controversial, and he's still the major source for many historians today of what happened to the Armenians under the Young Turks. And then his son becomes Treasury Secretary, improbably, and goes through the same, grapples with the same kind of genocidal issue with regard to World War II and the Holocaust. So talk briefly about this symmetry and...
It's one of the main themes of the book, and it's something that tied the Treasury Secretary to Roosevelt. They were gentlemen farmers. They weren't quite neighbors, but they were the only two Democrats, they liked to joke, in Dutchess County. They went on long campaign trips upstate. Henry Morgenthau's role in winning New York for Roosevelt, and when he was coming back from polio, is an extraordinary tale that really hasn't been appreciated. And he becomes, as you say, improbably, he himself was shocked to be named Secretary of Treasury. He didn't start that way in 1933. And they did a lot of things together. Some reckless, some radical, although Henry, as I think you can gather by his nature, was very conservative. He wasn't really a New Dealer in the economic sense at all. He kept saying, what about the taxes? What about the deficit? Right. It kept him up at night. But Germany, literally from the very first days after Roosevelt is inaugurated, the two of them, it's underappreciated how much FDR understood Germany. He had gone every summer as a young boy. And there were two things which stuck in his mind: the martial spirit, the drumming in the uniforms. FDR, almost until his death day, is saying, we got to stop the drumming and the uniforms. This had a very strong impact on him as a young boy. And there are notes where they're passing to each other in the cabinet meetings, where Henry sat right to Roosevelt's left in the cabinet meetings, and in their weekly lunches. He says in the spring of 1933, when very few Americans had even heard of Hitler, he says, what are we going to do about Germany?
Morganthau asks FDR.
Yes, and I remember looking in the microfilm in the archives, and Roosevelt says, Henry Jr. says, do you think there will be war? Late winter 1933, early spring, and FDR says, probably yes.
Right.
And that is the theme that came up again and again. It ties to the father because Senior, FDR had a convenient way of distinguishing the two. He called him Uncle Henry. Most of the Democratic Party, because he was Uncle Henry with the money bags since the Wilson campaign in 1911. So Uncle Henry's fear was based on his own knowledge since the 1890s, when he had been in Germany, of this kind of martial spirit. He had seen the Kaiser in Kiel, in the Prussian capital of Kiel, as a young man. And he too, and through his friend Adolf Ochs, is almost annually giving interviews saying, watch out for Germany. Right. And this absolutely resonated with the Secretary of the Treasury.
So at one point you write that by the winter of 1943, Secretary Morganthau's men, quote, had the goods on the old guard at the State Department, meaning the old, largely political appointees who were blocking immigration, were blocking any attempt to rescue Jews. But, quote, the trouble was that they had ensnared their own boss as well. Can you explain Morgan's problem at this point?
Much like what happened during the Armenian genocide, with one marked difference. The ambassador to Constantinople, the Sublime Porte, as it was known then, was receiving a flood of consular reports from U.S. consuls who were in the regions across Turkey and as far as Aleppo, Syria, testifying to the horrors of the Armenian deportation and then mass murder, as well as Christian missionaries, American missionaries, and others. And they were all landing on the ambassador's desk. At first, he didn't believe them. He actually writes, this is unbelievable. And he's also friends with the Young Turks. Friends is too strong a word. But he sees them, they go for dinner. He's also friends, they go on horseback rides with the German ambassador. And he's beseeching them, saying, can this be true? And almost initially, he takes their word for it. And of course, the tide turns, and he has a crisis. And then he confronts Woodrow Wilson, Secretary Lansing, and says, this is the mass murder of the Armenians. Yeah. Cut to the height of World War II, the summer of 1942, which we now know it was not on the front pages of the New York Times, but we now know that's when the mass extermination really started, beginning in 41, but by the summer of 1942, it's inescapable. And Henry Morganthau sitting in Washington, his best friend, of course, is FDR. He's not the only, but he's the most prominent Jewish member of the cabinet. It's a place he doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to be, despite Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife's very, very good friend, saying, Henry, you are the President Franklin's conscience. And she didn't say that lightly, she meant it. And he is confronted with reports, specifically of the final solution. And it's a slow accretion of evidence, which, as you say, first the diplomats stationed in Europe do not want to transmit, and then in Washington, there's an absolute conspiracy to silence it, right, and to sit on it, quash it. And Henry is not going to run across the 300 yards to the Oval Office.
He doesn't want to have to do this, but he musters the courage to actually challenge his best friend and persuades him in the end.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary moral. It's an extraordinary moral drama, almost Shakespearean. Because what I had read when I started the research was, he led the charge and he brought Roosevelt to bring, to understand what was going on with the Holocaust and the Jews, and they had to act. That's actually not true at all. He gets there eventually, but it was 4 young men under him, New Deal, who were ideologues.
John Paley, among others.
And they were all lawyers who Morganthau had brought in. As I said, he was a famous delegator. He trusted their opinion. He he brought in the best and the brightest and delegated. And they came to him and said, Mr. Secretary, we have to do something. And they then write the famous report, which initially was titled "Report on the Murder of the report on the acquiescence of this government in the murder of the Jews." And that was too much for Henry. So it becomes a report to the president.
Right. But he succeeds in persuading Roosevelt at a very late stage, in January of 1944, to establish the War Refugee Board. And I think most historians agree that maybe as many as 200,000 lives were saved thereby, because they actually used government resources to try to set up rat lines to rescue people. And so it was something, but it was...
it was too little, too late.
Yeah.
And he had both political anguish, but he also had real physical. I interviewed his daughter, Dr. Joan Morganthau, and she was living in Washington at the time, and she said, she was going to school there in high school, and she said, my father had terrible migraines his whole life, but during what he called these terrible 18 months, he couldn't sleep. There was real moral and physical anguish. And he was going to confront his best friend. I mean, FDR was the sun god, not just for the whole country, but specifically for Junior, yeah.
So that brings us to talk a little bit after, in April of 45, just as the war is ending, Secretary Morganthau attends his first Passover Seder. I was sort of shocked by that. That was his first Seder?
Well, in his own words, there may be those who say, who dispute that, but I was shocked. As I said, he would dictate. I think they call it the Ediphone. And he dictated one son, the future DA, was first in the Mediterranean and then in the Pacific. He was a highly decorated naval officer. He actually joined the Navy when he was 20, when he was still at Amherst College. Other son, Henry III, was with General Patton in Europe. And he would dictate to them, and being the Secretary of the Treasury, the Ediphone, I think they were actual discs, would arrive. And he said, boys, I just have to tell you, I went to the most wonderful thing in Daytona Beach. They call it a Seder. And I had the same reaction when I read that, yeah.
So they weren't practicing Jews.
It's a very, very complex issue. As I said, I had spent several years chasing people like Isaiah Oggins, who were Russian Jews. German Jews, especially the German Jews of Manhattan of this generation, the relationship to Judaism is extremely complex. Uncle Henry, the senior, who was the real estate baron, became the most vocal, prominent anti-Zionist in America.
Yeah, he actually advised his son at one point, don't have anything to do with the Jews. So,
that was when he was almost dying. That was when he was much later, yeah. He has an extraordinary evolution in his relationship to Judaism. And he had many German Jews became Christian Scientists at the turn of the century. He founded with Rabbi Weiss, the most charismatic and prominent rabbi and leader of the American Reform Jewish community, Stephen Weiss. They founded what they called the Free Synagogue, which was going to be pewless and dewless, which was a direct public swipe at Temple Emmanuel, the cathedral on Fifth Avenue. He then long story short, very long story, he goes through an evolution. He visits the Holy Land when he was ambassador.
And he becomes a Zionist.
And he becomes a Zionist. He's in a certain way. He was Lazarus. It's another thread that goes all the way back to the little town of Bamberg in what is today southern Germany, that they were devoutly ecumenical. Lazarus, when he made money as a cigar, in his cigar factories, gave a portal to a Catholic church, gave a bell to the Protestant church, gave money to the free thinkers. And what got him into a little bit of trouble here in New York City is that he was starting business, as he called a business, the Golden Book of Life, which was to, after the high holy days, to inscribe yourself in the book of life for the coming year. He sold these as philanthropic books.
Right.
And it was quite a good business. It was quite a good
It
business.
was a little weird.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, I want to spend the last few minutes of our conversation talking about the DA. You spend a good part of the book, I'd say a plurality of the book on the DA, and I sense your deep admiration for him, and he comes alive as a real character, very complicated. You get into his family life, his marriage, the tragedy of his wife dying of cancer early, his second marriage to a much younger woman, Lucinda Franks. It becomes a really interesting character, and I sense that this is the Morganthau that you admired the most. But you also are very critical of him. I mean, you go through his cases, and you praise him for his emphasis, his decision when he becomes DA to focus on white-collar criminals as opposed to violent crime, because those he thinks are the real criminals who create the greatest harm. But then, you go through his attitude about civil liberties. He's not a great civil libertarian in some of his investigative techniques. He indicts Roy Cohn 3 times and tries him 4 times on the 3 indictments and fails to win a conviction. He goes after the mafia and goes after the Gambino family in particular with a really complicated sting operation. And then it leads to a settlement that puts them out of business, forces them to sell their underhanded business, but no jail time. Similarly, BCCI, the scandal over the bank that in the 1990s, he was relentless in going after these white-collar criminals and was fearless in going after a paragon of the American establishment, Clark Clifford. And yet, again, Clifford, for complicated reasons for his health and such, he gets off. But his life at the end is pretty much harassed by this investigation. And then, of course, there's the jogger case, the Central Park Five. Anyway, you're very tough on him. You go into great detail about the mistakes that were made, the misjudgments, the calculations, and anyway, talk about your judgments about these.
Well, it's a huge question, and it's 50 years of law and order in New York City, and not just in New York City, but the U.S. and when you talk about BCCI, the world. And part of it is the radical revisioning that Bob Morganthau did when he became U.S. Attorney in the Southern District in New York under JFK and Bobby Kennedy. And I entitled that part of the book, The Sovereign District. It's not my title, it's what the alumni of that office, who all went on to a man, and 2 women, I think, to become illustrious in their own right. And it's an extraordinary group of people. And in a way that the Secretary of Treasury also had, but he didn't inspire them the way that Bob Morganthau did in the Southern District. They were fighting a war, and many wars at once. And the privilege for me was to meet those men like Frank Thomas, who went on to head the Ford Foundation, but was picked by Bobby Kennedy to run the Bed-Stuy redevelopment program. And as a black man in the 60s going in to work for the man every day, the hours I...
The boss.
No, the man meaning the federal government.
Federal government, right.
He was an associate United States attorney. And the hours, so I really had an education and a privilege listening to them. And one of the things that he did many, many things, but I think fundamentally he said, the buck stops here, even to Bobby Kennedy. Roy Cohn is one example, but there was also the case, which I think I probably spent a year at least on it. It's 2 sentences in the book. Very, very quickly, Dean Landis was the dean of the Harvard Law School. And some say Morganthau hounded him to his death. He was also, as David Nassau here, was very close to Joe Kennedy Sr. He helped write the SEC Act. He was, in his own lifetime, a legend, a legendary figure. He didn't pay his income taxes for several years. Little problem. And the Kennedys said, let this one go. And Bob Morganthau, early on, as U.S. Attorney, said, absolutely not. There were many, many cases like that, whether they be Democrats, whether they be close Kennedy cronies, whether they be Jewish leaders, whether they be the president of the New York Stock Exchange, he put away. This was his trademark. And so that the men, and they were largely men, in the U.S. Attorney's Office listened to that, and they got their marching orders. And that really became, it was the motto of his grandfather's friend, Adolf Hawks, without fear or favor. But it became his motto. And that really leads all the way up through the 35 years in the DA's office.
He was relentless, but he was a man of complete integrity he would go after any.
Yeah, I mean, I think John Kerry says that we needed more Bob Morgenthau's. That's not me, that's John Kerry.
And he made mistakes along the way, and some cases failed, but... Yeah.
Well, the Jogger case, I'll just do 2 minutes on the Jogger case quickly, but in a moment. But BCCI, to him, he actually, you're bringing up all the themes across the generations. His father went after his own predecessor, Andrew Mellon, for a tax case, who had been Secretary of Treasury. And it was not a pretty case. And his father absolutely believed in you have to go after. His father, as I said, when the Treasury at that time, you were head of, it encompassed not only customs, but the IRS and the Secret Service, and about 15 other different divisions. So he liked being a cop. The chippy Henry Jr., who never graduated Cornell, he liked being a law enforcer, and that definitely rubbed off. Not a lot rubbed off, certainly none of the chippiness rubbed off on the DA, but that part did, the suspicion. And usually his instinct was right. He had an extraordinary sixth sense, Bob Morganthau. And so when he became U.S. Attorney, as I said, he let the Kennedys know right away. Don't try anything. Right. And then he also realized that you have to do violent crime, which was the mafia, when J. Edgar Hoover said, there is no such thing as organized crime. Right. It was Morganthau who created and delivered Joe Valachi, the first man to break omerta, break the code of silence, and it started this war on the mafia. So it's...
and the Jogger case, it was a terrible problem, but he actually, dealt with it. And when evidence emerged to show that the wrong people had been convicted, he didn't cover it up. He investigated it and owned up to it.
Yeah, it was, he could never understand. Bernie Goetz was a surprise to him, the Bernie Goetz case, you all remember. Mm-hmm. He did not expect, talk about his sixth sense, he didn't expect the vitriol after Bernie Goetz shot those young boys on the subway. Yeah. He said, little women would come up to me in restaurants and practically spit on me, literally, for not being strong enough. And with the Jogger case, he also didn't understand that whether it be the police department, whether it be those factions within the DA's office, or whether it be the press, that he didn't do the right thing on the reinvestigation in 2002 when Matthias Reyes comes forward and says, I did it, and I did it alone. meaning the rape and the attack on Patricia Miley. When I began asking about it, he said it was a no-brainer. He said, I didn't learn much at Yale Law, but I learned one thing: read the statute. And the statute says when newly discovered evidence, I'm not a lawyer, when newly discovered evidence comes forward that would have changed the juror's opinion at the time of the trial, you have to vacate. Now, how he did that, that's a sentence, but how he worked the defense, the press, local civic leaders.
You have a whole chapter on this.
Yeah,
so.
and the police department, how he worked all of that was actually his tribute. And it was Barry Scheck, the founder of the Innocence Project, who, again, I was surprised, no great crony of Morganthau's, the one person in the country we can thank for the exoneration movement. There are others, of course, who followed Barry Scheck, but Barry Scheck called me up and he said, I'm so glad you're doing this book. I said, why? He said, because Bob Morganthau was the one man who could have done that. And he said, and Barry said, it has to do with his family. It goes back to his father doing the right thing and his grandfather doing the right thing.
No, it's an amazing story. We're running out of time, but I want to quickly ask you about two other issues. The DA, I'd never heard this, I guess, but the DA became convinced that Richard Nixon flew to Europe and to open up Swiss bank accounts. And he was desperate to document and investigate this, but he could never prove it, I guess. But you actually, in the book, have...
Yeah, it's don't give it away. It's one of the gems of making it up to page 800 and something, wherever that is.
It's there.
Yeah, I reproduce it, yeah. And I actually have a copy of the letter. What Kai's referring to, sorry to cut you off, is an anonymous letter. The DA got, as you can imagine, a lot of information came across the transom, whether it was on the phone or people walking in. And every once in a while, his memory was extraordinary. I haven't talked about his memory. His intellect was extraordinary, but his memory for a biographer, it wasn't just the Morganthau diaries, the 900 volumes. I had the living DA who had as many volumes in his head. And it was extraordinary. He would remember people's middle initials from 1932. He could remember not just the building that's there now, but the 3 buildings that were there before, when there was the elevator train that went past it, yeah. But in terms of Nixon, Roy Cohn, you mentioned, was the white whale that got away. Nixon was another one who got away. And there's the famous, I think it's a Oliphant, political cartoon of Morganthau wearing a Sherlock Holmes hat, and the bloodhounds are running, and there's footprints, and Nixon is, at bay, and that's when Nixon fired him in 1970. And he absolutely believed that not only was Nixon a crook, but that he had the goods on him, and it was Swiss bank. One of his big manias, it wasn't just BCCI, it was Swiss banking and offshore banking, something we still haven't dealt with.
Right.
And so he got this anonymous letter with the account, and he could never prove it.
So, final question, why did he never go after Donald Trump?
It's a good question. Trump, and I address this in a whole chapter, and Trump and he were friends in the way people who go to benefits and galas in New York are friendly. They introduced each other literally at the lectern. And Morganthau, in many ways, had this complex, long relationship with Trump, almost as long as anyone in New York City. It's not unexpected, but it's a fact, and I needed to explain it if I can. And we spoke about it a lot in real time. And I was in the room one time, he wasn't yet president, when Donald called. I actually, one of the great practices of the DA was, whether by habit or intent, he made you complicit in every phone call because the speakerphone.
Because the
speakerphone is on. And again, for a biographer, this is a dream. And it was transactional. It was a relationship that from the very beginning was transactional. And he knew
Donald would contribute to his charities.
Well, there were two things. He knew Fred Trump, the father. He knew Donald's sister, who was a federal judge in New Jersey. He liked them. He liked Donald. He never said he's a good guy. He said he's fun. And all of New York City was charmed by the guy who was a clown, the guy who was a showman. And knowing what we now know, we know that, of course, he was a con man and a charlatan. Donald needed Robert Morganthau a lot more than Robert Morganthau ever needed Trump. And there were two stages. One was when you had the outer borough son of the low-rise developer from Queens coming in, and it was the famous Woolman rink, the ice skating rink in Central Park. And Ed Koch said to Morganthau, I need a cutout, and you're going to be the cutout. You get Donald to do it. I don't want to have my fingerprints on it. And Donald did it. He actually, he didn't do it as he said he did it. He held press conferences every day. He used the press, and the Woolman rink opened. What the DA did was, if you're going to do this, you have to do the second rink, which is a story that's really little known. And that was the rink used for PAL, the Police Athletic League. There were two philanthropies that were extremely close to Robert Morgenthau's heart. One is the Police Athletic League, which is for New York City youth, sports and culture. And he had started working as the chairman of that in 1961 under Bobby Kennedy. And the second is the Museum of Jewish Heritage, known as the Holocaust Museum in Lower Manhattan, that he literally, again, at the behest of Ed Koch, built and chaired for many, many years. And it's a long and complicated story, but in short, Trump gave money to both. He said it was his money. We now know it was the foundation's money, which wasn't his money. But I went back again and again to Trump's people, to those who knew both men, to the chief of the investigations units, and I said, how did this work in terms of the DA's office? And we now know exactly how Donald Trump did it as president. He walked across the street to Bob Mueller and says, can't you see this way clear? He went to James Comey, can't you see this way through? He tried the same thing, and it never went anywhere in terms of investigating partners or failed partners. The worst that people who really look closely at Trump in New York could come up with was that he stiffed contractors. This was an open secret. But the DA and the DA's office said, we're not a collection agency. And so he would like to use, and it's in the book, my great friend Bob, you're the greatest, and exclamation marks and Sharpies, tried to use him to investigate his partners, and it didn't work. But of course, this is the part that, if it's a criticism, it's the complete, as much as I could, the complete portrait of the man. He was blinded by Trump, and he didn't think he was going to be president. He said,
like all sorts of New Yorkers were blinded.
Well, most of the world. He says Donald was surprised. He wrote him a congratulatory telegram the next day, not a telegram, an email, and I actually was unwittingly involved in that relationship while he was president. I found a photograph of the two of them together. I sent it to the DA, and you know what happened to it. It was sent on to the White House, and Donald, he never, I'm told that Trump never reads email. It was printed out from my email.
Oh, really?
Came back with a Sharpie, Bob, you're the greatest. And when Morganthau passed away, even though he didn't think he ever would, Trump tweeted about it.
Yeah.
We've lost one of the greatest.
Well, it's a terrific story, a terrific book, and we now are way over time. I talked too much, sorry. But let's take some questions from the audience and then maybe a few from Zoom. Just raise your hand and come to the microphone.
Don't be shy.
And don't be shy, right.
I'll ask one from Zooms to get things started.
Okay.
This is from someone who's usually here, Glenn Spear.
Oh.
And he said, could you speak about Bob Morgenthau's relationship with Giuliani when Giuliani was U.S. attorney as well as mayor? Could you also comment on his relations with Koch and Bloomberg?
Yeah, we didn't cover those. Thanks for the question. I interviewed Rudy Giuliani before he was the Rudy Giuliani we now openly ridicule. And it was actually a really fascinating interview. I was surprised. It was thoughtful, and it was detailed. He had distinct, vivid memories of Bob Morgenthau, which I don't think are really well known at all. He was a law clerk in the Southern District when Morganthau was the U.S. Attorney. And when I talked about inspiring that young cadre who looked up to Morganthau, Rudy Giuliani was one of them. I think it was just a summer. And he called him the boss. He looked up to him, and he told, of course, a different story that later, about a dozen years later, maybe longer, when Giuliani had been in the Justice Department and he was coming back to New York and he didn't have a job, then Morganthau, who was then DA early in his term, said, "I need you as my chief assistant. Can you, would you come work for the DA's office?" And Giuliani told me that. Because there's a paper trail in everything that Morganthau did, I called the office, and within an hour, this didn't happen very often in this book, within an hour, thanks to Ida Van Lint, the repository of all information in the DA's office going back to Morgenthau's predecessor, Frank Hogan, there was a PDF of the letter and the resume of Rudolph Giuliani saying, "Dear Mr. Morganthau, thank you for seeing me. I appreciated the lunch. And please remember, if there should be an opening, I would be most grateful."
Okay.
So there was an interaction, but it was slightly different than the way the mayor remembered it. And it wasn't quite as bad a relationship as it was with Roy Cohn, as it was with Clark Clifford. But if there was one thing, I talked about his suspicion and his sixth sense. If there was one thing that Morganthau, really the DA, you could sense right away. You could have a cup of coffee with him. You could sense it right away. If there was fakery, someone who was pompous, someone who had a slightly too large ego and definitely larger than his own, you knew it. And that was part of the animosity between Rudy Giuliani and Bob Morganthau. There were others. He didn't like it when people played up this feud between the two of them, but there was definitely a feud when Giuliani was the U.S. Attorney and Morganthau was the DA, up to the point where sometimes FBI agents would be trying to get to a witness before the DA's investigators were. And there were many famous cases like that. And sorry, what was the second half of the question? I can't remember now.
Koch and Bloomberg.
I think Bloomberg I already covered when I talked about someone who had an ego bigger than his. They had publicly famous contretemps, which I talk about in the book, and privately as well. They didn't get along. They're very different personalities. Partly that had to do with the mayor's propensity to go down to Florida and the Bahamas and to park at least his philanthropy offshore. The DA brought that issue to him and said, "We've got to do something about offshore." They didn't like that at all. In the end, I think they made peace. There was a very nice retirement party at Gracie Mansion when Mayor Bloomberg was still mayor for Morganthau. Koch, you couldn't imagine two greater dissimilar bedfellows, and as Koch, I think you quoted it.
And big ego.
in the beginning. Yeah, Koch is outlandish, reckless, lovable rogue, larger than life, and a natural, phenomenal politician. Whether it's on the streets or the airwaves. Bob Morganthau was, as I describe in the book,
Not a good politician.
a horrific politician. He ends up being a pretty good speaker. Even his older brother said he's gotten to be a good public speaker. But when he ran for governor twice.
We have another question.
Thank you for a really fascinating conversation. You mentioned mistakes that he made. You mentioned there were two situations. I know of a situation where he went to prosecute a stockbroker, collected all the stockbroker's records, kept them in limbo for maybe 12 months, 18 months, and then decided there was no case. But he basically shut down the stockbroker from doing any work. Did you come across situations like that?
I don't remember that particular case. Was it a well-known case?
No, not a well-known.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I didn't go to law school, and one of the things I learned talking to both the DA, but also the youngest members of his office, and then interviewing his successor, Cyrus Vance, is the incredible power that these assistant district attorneys have, as well as the DA, in terms of subpoenas, in terms of really being able to step in and investigate. It's one of the questions about Donald Trump that they said, you know, if someone had brought a complaint, then we would have investigated. But it's not always the case. So I can't speak to that particular case. But along the way, there were many very close friends who became illustrious defense attorneys from the Morganthau Southern District Office who would say the exact same thing on behalf of their clients. You've gone too far. It wasn't just Clark Clifford. By the way, he did bring down the bank of VCCI.
Yes,
so you don't want to, yeah, and that stands as a landmark. But he never wore that lightly, and he tried to get the youngest of the assistant district attorneys to understand that, you know, the famous phrase, with great power comes great responsibility, because you can ruin a person's life. And it's, for me, that was a surprise, and it was, it also took my breath away that, you know, they're not kids, but they've graduated law school, and now we actually have a problem getting young assistant district attorneys. It's a grave crisis. People are leaving the office. They're not paid very much. It was once when it was in the 1980s and 90s when you had the flood of violent crime, something that we did not talk about during the crack epidemic. You would be taxed so heavily, trying not dozens but hundreds of cases, that it's very easy to make a mistake. And that was one thing that Bob Morganthau tried to make sure, imbue that responsibility.
But did he collect businesses' records and keep them unavailable for lengthy periods of time, and basically shutting down the business and then saying, whoops, made a little mistake, no prosecution? Did that happen? You don't know.
That I can't speak of the specific case, no.
Okay. All right,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thad, do we have another Zoom?
Here's one I don't quite understand, but I'll read it anyway. In the summer of '73, I was in Dublin, and upon introduction to an Irishman asked me, upon a learning of my New York connections, did you ever meet Frank Hogan? Do you think D.A. Morganthau was also a legend abroad?
Was also a legend abroad. Oh, abroad. That's a great question. Thank you. Frank Hogan, as I mentioned, was Morganthau's predecessor and almost served as long, and was also a legend in his own time. And yes, if you are ever in Turkey, if you are in Armenia, if you are in Israel, I got an email from someone in Australia recently. The name Morganthau, it's not just the Secretary of Treasury, but the DA, whose name still goes far, in part because of those cases like BCCI. And also the terrorism cases. He's seen as someone who stood for doing the right thing, and also making the call that we are at risk. You talked about civil liberties. There was the cost before. Wasn't happy with the Patriot Act, but before then he was loudly and clearly and often ringing the bell about whether it be the nuclear ambitions of a country like Iran, or whether it be cybersecurity in the United States. His vision was always beyond New York County. But whether it's the legacy of the Armenians, and it's really the legacy of what you mentioned, the War Refugee Board, that the name Morganthau is known abroad. I'm not quite sure why Frank Hogan was known, though, in Ireland. I guess just as a son of Ireland.
I have a question about the Morgenthau wealth. How large was the wealth of the family? I have two other small questions too. As I remember, Morgenthau used to like to hire a lot of the sons of the rich and famous. Was his office really a merit-oriented office, or was he more likely to hire John F. Kennedy Jr.? And lastly, I don't want to defend Richard Nixon, but it seems odd to me that he would have a Swiss bank account. What would be the reason that he would want one? Because it's not really illegal to have one. There's a question on the income tax form. Do you have a foreign bank account? If you check the wrong box and it's incorrect, that could be a violation. But the whole thing seems a little bit odd to me. I never heard it before.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. He did hire a number of sons and daughters of, it wasn't just wealthy, it was also the political class, including Senator Alphonse de Matos. So I don't think it was necessarily a deliberate way to leverage the political class. With the Kennedys, it actually came back and he got into more than one private contretemps with Jackie Kennedy, Onassis at that time. It was not a favor, although he did grow close to John F. Kennedy Jr. And everyone I interviewed who worked, it's not in the book at all, worked with John F. Kennedy Jr. said he really took it seriously. He actually tried cases, and it was the one thing in his life that he felt very, very proud of, that he was taken seriously on his own merit. And they would sneak him into the office. But that's what made the tabloids, is that he hired the Kennedy children. It was a huge office, more than 350, 400 lawyers. One thing that he started even when he was U.S. attorney, he didn't look just to the white shoe. He didn't look just to the Ivy League schools. He looked to the New York City schools, Fordham, St. John's, and he loved to talk about the people who came from those schools and the people who came from different walks of life. Famously, he hired a guy who drove a tractor, and he was a farmer. And during the interview, he said, "You're hired." He loved people who came from different walks of life, whether they be veterans. One guy he loved who was in the DA's office, I think he might still be there, was a veteran of the Iraq War. Another guy was a race car driver. He loved children of immigrants, and the most famous, of course, Sonia Sotomayor. We lost track. I tried to, with the fact checker, tried to count up how many alums of just the DA's office went on to the judiciary, all the way, of course, to the Supreme Court. I think it's something north of 90. So they weren't just the few sons of those who were connected to the political class. With Nixon, it wasn't just the Swiss bank account. He really thought that he was guilty of serious financial fraud. And it's far too complex a story to go into here, but books have been written on it with his relationship with the famous, his best friend, Bibi Rebozo. And Morgenthau really was the one who tried to take on, long before Watergate, of course, the corruption that he saw, the financial corruption at the highest levels of the Nixon administration. He was very close to, he was an equal opportunity prosecutor. He was going after the Speaker of the House, McCormick, the powerhouse from Boston, but he wanted also to go after the head of the SEC. He was an equal opportunity prosecutor. Sorry to be brief there, though. Thank you.
Final question.
Oh, size of the family wealth. I go into great detail. I hope it's granular. How much they actually had, and one thing we didn't get a chance to talk about, so thank you, was that they all married well. They married not above their station, but certainly above their bank accounts. The ambassador to Turkey actually married a Lehman. So Lazarus Morgenthau is the great-grandfather of the DA on one side. On his maternal side, it's Mayor Lehman. So quite a bit of difference between the Lehmans and Lazarus Morgenthau. And it wasn't a tremendous, he didn't like talking about wealth at all. He didn't like talking about it, and if he did, he would say we were never really that wealthy. But they survived the Depression with more than $1 million, $2 or $3 million in the estates. And I went through, they kept all the records, so I went through all the archives on that.
Just curious, since you talked about 4 generations, and there doesn't seem to be a fifth, and if you interviewed the children of Bob Morganthau, and what impression you got as to, why he might stop there after 4 generations of being so prominent?
I like the question until the last part of it. Why did I stop at 4?
No. Why it might stop the Morganthau family being so prominent after 4 generations?
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. I don't mean to be in any way facetious. No, I wanted to preserve my marriage and my family. Although Mr. Caro did say at one point, he whispered to me at an event, he said, "Have you thought about 3 volumes?" No, I think we're now in the 7th generation. Maybe the 5th born in the United States, and the tradition of public service continues. Henry III's daughter, Sarah Morganthau, just recently ran for Congress unsuccessfully in Rhode Island, and she was a high-ranking official in the Obama administration, and the DA and Lucinda Frank's son, Joshua Morganthau, is in I would say, a very prominent way, continuing to serve the public good. He's running the family farm that his grandfather started in 1913, and really making, especially during apple season, a go of it. I think it will continue, yeah. But I'm not going to be the chronicler, though.
Thank you, Andrew. This
Thanks.
has been lovely,
Thank you all.
very interesting.